Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professors Kurt Gray and Paul Bloom. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Kurt Gray is an award-winning professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. His research examines the psychology of morality, politics, religion, and artificial intelligence, focusing on how people make moral judgments and bridge political divides. He is also the author of The Mind Club: Who Thinks, What Feels, and Why It Matters, and his new book, Outraged, argues that our moral divisions stem from different perceptions of harm, not fundamentally different values. We're honored to welcome back Paul Bloom to FAN. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Yale University. His work seeks to uncover how children and adults understand themselves, others, and the world at large, with a special focus on pleasure, morality, religion, fiction, and art, all the important things. His research is heavily interdisciplinary, incorporating concepts from cognitive, social, and developmental psychology, as well as evolutionary theory, behavioral economics, and philosophy. FAN hosted Professor Bloom in 2023 in support of his book, Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. He was in conversation with one of our favorites, Jennifer Senior, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And now let's welcome Kurt Gray and Paul Bloom to FAN.
Yeah, thanks for having us. A big thanks to Fan for setting this up, and for Lonnie in particular. I'm delighted to be invited back. I had a great discussion with Jennifer Senior way back about a year and a half ago, and I'm totally thrilled to be talking to Kurt Gray right now. So we're gonna talk about your book, Kurt, and I just want to start by saying how much I enjoy it. Um, and it works on different levels. You have one of the most prestigious and influential research programs in all of psychology. And in your book, you go for these amazing experiments, some of which we're going to talk about, study after study after study, kind of giving real insights into how we think about right and wrong and the nature of our differences and how people can bridge these differences. So it works on that level. It's just as a pure science book, it's just terrific. But then there's the broader project, which is you talk about political differences, you talk about outrage, you talk about the sort of hatred that Republicans feel towards Democrats and Democrats feel towards Republicans, and you say some really interesting things about what's going on, and you offer solutions. And so it's both a book about science, but also a very human book. And so everybody should buy it. And I want to begin with this killer, unexpected, bizarre, out of the blue question you've never been asked before. Kurt, can you tell us about your book?
You bet. So I think you already did a really great job, Paul, of talking about the kind of like two enterprises of the book here that are kind of combined together, which is one, it's a book about science, a book about how we understand our moral minds and how we maybe misunderstand our moral minds. It's also a book about our human nature, right? Who are we deep down in the myths of evolution? Are we predator? Are we prey? And then the third myth that it looks at is how best should we bridge divides? And so there's these kind of three big chunks of the book, but they really weave together in the kind of common understanding, which is that we have a moral mind that is grounded in concerns about harm. And so when you think of liberals and conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, it's easy to assume that there's different values, different foundations that they have. How else are we so divided? But I think if you look deeper, what you can see is that we all have minds that are really focused on protecting ourselves from harm, safeguarding ourselves and our family and society. And yet we tend to see harms differently. We tend to emphasize different victims. And it's by focusing on these different victims, by having disagreements about who's most vulnerable to suffering, that's what gives us disagreement in politics, right? So it doesn't mean that we don't have the same moral convictions deep down, which is to protect people, but instead our assumptions that feed into those things about who or what is most vulnerable to harm, that's where we come apart. And so the book is ultimately about how to understand ourselves and harness that for better conversations and better agreement or better disagreement, really, whether it's in politics or, with your friends and family, with a partner you maybe disagree with, right? Someone at the PTA meeting, it doesn't matter, right? Moral disagreement is in some sense all the same, and it's all about competing perceptions of harm or victimhood.
So there's a lot here, and we're going to zoom in on different parts of it. But I want to sort of start by asking about something you have on page one, which is about the target audience of the book. So this is reading from your book. You say, although some people are happy to be angry, most of us want less outrage and more understanding. This book is for everyone who wants to better understand the other side and the hidden psychology behind moral conflicts. So it made me think of this kind of joke. Adlai Stevenson was running for office, and he gave this talk, and then one of his fans ran up to him and said, "Every intelligent American will vote for you," and he responded saying, "That won't work. I need a majority." And so I'm wondering, do you have a majority? So much of your book is talking about how tribal we are, how you have all these statistics on how Republicans think Democrats are scum of the earth and vice versa. It seems like people are perfectly happy to be angry about us. So, how many people do you think are going to be receptive to the message in your book?
Well, I mean, it's true that I have a lot of statistics that show that we think the other side is maybe stupid or evil. And those numbers are pretty high, but we misunderstand actually how much the other side dislikes us. And in fact, the other side dislikes us a lot less than we think. And I'm not talking about elites, okay? I'm not talking about Elon Musk, right? I'm just talking about the everyday people who voted differently or who disagree with you on hot button issues, like those folks. And it turns out that there's a lot of people in America who want to understand. And so there's this report that came out from an organization called More in Common. You can tell by their name that they're trying to bridge divides. They've got an agenda of understanding, I guess you could say. But what they show is that if you kind of analyze, the American electorate, 65% of Americans are part of a hidden tribe called the exhausted majority. These are people who aren't yelling on social media, who aren't trying to scream at others. I mean, maybe they, will occasionally wear a certain kind of hat or a shirt or have a bumper sticker, but at the end of the day, they're tired, right? They're tired and they want a way out to have conversations and connections with family members that they've lost, right? Friends that they've lost, coworkers that they're having like beef with. And so I do think that there are many more people than we might think are into understanding. And I think if you give people the chance, right, even if they initially don't feel like they're into understanding, if you give someone the chance to kind of reach out and to kind of connect, I think many more people will take us up on that than we think.
So good. So it's a very interesting time for your book to come out, and I'm not sure whether it's the worst possible time or the best possible time. Maybe both. But as you may have heard, Donald Trump has just been elected into president of the United States, doing a lot of big moves and everything. And from everyone I talk to, the feelings are run hot. I posted an announcement on X saying that I'm going to talk to you about it, a little clip of the thing, and somebody I think we both know, a psychologist, Tej Rai, wrote in response a little tweet saying, "Gonna write a book someday called Against Common Ground." And I kind of get it. He's saying your book has in the title Getting Common Ground. I don't. I feel like, and this is where our sympathies are together. I really want to understand the people I strongly disagree with. But what do you say to somebody who says our goal as a society shouldn't be to establish common ground? It should be, I don't know, maybe to win these important fights. We're talking about we were talking about the weather. If you think climate change is important, maybe you don't want to find common ground to people who don't. Maybe you want to persuade them, or if you don't persuade them, just win.
Agreed that many people feel like winning should be a goal. But to your previous point, right, you need a majority to win. And if you are not in the majority, then what you need to do is you need to understand that majority and you need to find ways to connect with them, to build coalitions with them, to find allies within those ranks, and right, find these coalitions to move forward. And so I I do think it's completely fine to have your moral convictions and to work towards them. I think there are many people on the other side, right, who have similar moral
Yep.
convictions and want to work towards them. But I think especially if you feel like you're on the side that lost the election, right? I mean, maybe it's even harder to feel like you should reach out and build common ground. But I think it's actually the most important time, right? Because if you don't control the levers of power in society, by understanding those who do and by building connections with them and by trying to find compromise and common ground to move forward, I think it's actually incredibly important right now.
That's interesting. I would, as somebody who maybe not surprising, given I'm a fellow academic, a fellow professor, I'm one of the people who was on the losing side. Though I'm in Canada now, so it's kind of different. My feeling is that, well, I might want common ground, but say the hardcore Trump supporters don't want common ground. They just want to win and grind my nose into the dust and destroy everything I value. I guess you would say that this pessimism I have is the sort of thing you argue against in the book, that I'm too quick to demonize the other side.
Exactly. I think you are too quick. I mean, and I think one problem in society today is that we live in such different realities, right? Different echo chambers, different bubbles, segregated neighborhoods where you're unlikely to run into someone who votes differently or who disagrees with you on hot button issues. But I think for many years we lived in more, heterogeneous neighborhoods. And I think when you have the chance, and when I have the chance of talking to someone who I think voted different, right? So we have a HOA and we have a landscaping crew that comes by. I talk to the landscaping guy, right? He's the head of the company. I'm pretty sure he votes differently than
Yeah.
I vote, but we always have lovely conversations. We talk about his kids. We talk about what his hopes are for the future for his company. And I think at the end of the day, right, we have respect for each other. And I know if I needed help, he would be there. And
Yeah.
I know, and he would come to me for help. And so I think there's a real powerful way in that you can kind of reach out and kind of build human connection even across these divides. But we're just out of practice and we maybe don't feel like it's worth it. But I think it is worth it. And every time I do have these conversations, they go much better than you might think they will.
So yeah, so there's you, I'll call you a liberal, and there's your guy, who call him a conservative. And one question which psychologists have been struggling for a long time with is what makes somebody a liberal and what makes somebody a conservative. And well, if you ask a liberal, and many psychologists say, well, liberals are intelligent and conservatives are stupid. If you ask a conservative, they might say conservatives are moral, love family, love America. Liberals are depraved. There's some psychologists who have a view that say conservatives are more fearful in general. They're terrified. They think everything's a threat. Um, they want to justify the system. Jonathan Haidt, who's a figure, a well-known psychologist who figures heavily in your book because he's sort of in some way somebody you strongly disagree with over a lot of things, would say the difference between liberals and conservatives has to do with moral foundations. Liberals are very concerned with harm and fairness. Conservatives are also concerned with purity and authority and community. And you reject all of these views. And your view is, well, yeah. So yeah. What is your view about the difference between liberals and conservatives?
So I think liberals and conservatives were all concerned about harm and threats, maybe understand those threats differently, right? How we're raised, our worldviews. If you believe that there's an afterlife and there's a hell where souls can suffer eternally, then you've got a different sense of potential harms, perhaps, than a secular atheist. But I think we're all ultimately fixated on kind of protecting ourselves and our family on potential harms. And I think, you know, it is true, I think to give John his due, that he's tapped into some interesting differences in the kind of language that liberals and conservatives use, rhetoric, you might argue, in kind of political speeches. And I think this is the evolution of kind of John Haidt's research from his advisor, Richard Schwader, who studied conversations about morality in India versus America, and kind of importing those insights into an American context. So it is true if I tell you, like, there's a Liberty Caucus, you probably
Yeah.
say, well, that's probably conservative, right? Or, the Freedom Caucus is probably conservative too, right? Where if you talk about social justice, we're like, okay, maybe that's more progressive. But I think there's really no differences in the values that liberals or conservatives kind of hew to. It just matters how you assess those values. And I think this is why people believe in moral foundations and shouldn't, because the items that are used to assess those foundations are so heavily weighted towards conservatives for like the purity and the authority and the loyalty. So I'll give you an example. If you say like, well, only, conservatives are into purity because they're really concerned with premarital sex. Well, we've known for decades that conservatives are, less into premarital sex than are liberals. But let me tell you an example of this time I went on a hot yoga juice cleanse, right? And I'm really concerned about the purity of my chakras. Well, now you're like, that's a progressive, right? That's a liberal thing. Like who does a hot yoga juice cleanse? Or if I talk about, showing loyalty with unions and labor solidarity, well, now that's progressive, right? Or
Yeah.
authority, right? You're caring about civil rights leaders and obeying their authority, or like Biden when he was president, right? That is a liberal authority. And so I think it's not the case that there's certain values that only liberals or conservatives care about. I mean, there's hundreds of values, like punctuality, having self-discipline, right? We could talk about values this entire time and never reach the end of a list. But I think what really drives our moral mind is when those values are paired with perceptions of harm, right? So if you see disobeying authority as causing harm, you see it as immoral. If you see not being fair as causing harm, you see it as immoral. If you see impurity as causing harm, you see it as immoral. We go on and on, but right, it's a
Yeah.
very simple truth, which is that if you perceive harm in something, then you see it as immoral.
So this is maybe the big idea of a lot of your work and a lot of the book, which is morality is about harm. And I want to sort of deal with that in different ways because it's a very provocative and interesting claim. It's controversial in our field. Um, so I would, somebody might say, oh, um, uh, somebody worries about telling a lie about somebody after they're dead and said that's wrong. And they say that doesn't have to do with harm. You say, no, it does have to do with harm. If you think about it, people think things are harmed. Um, somebody, there's an act of say two cousins in some society, cousins shouldn't get married, but they do get married. And then I say, oh, well, that's not harm. You say people do worry about it, about harm. And I want to zoom in on it. But there's something I was wondering, which I want to sort of ask you, and I'm not sure it was in the book. What your argument is, basically the moral difference between conservatives and liberals is they're worried about different sorts of harms. So and so it's always harm. It's just different sort of harms that they're sensitive to. Um, a progressive might be worried about microaggressions, and that's a kind of harm. While a conservative might worry about, say, disrespect for the flag, and that's a type of harm. But do you have any ideas of what makes somebody focus on this kind of harm rather than that kind of harm? Like, what would turn somebody into liberal or conservative, making them go this way or that way?
Yes, great question. And You know, it, I totally understand, right? Saying that like we all have the same moral mind. Maybe that's true. The data support it. I think it's true, right? But it's not sufficient when we're confronted with moral disagreement because we want to know, well, what's the root of that moral disagreement? And so you can point to some things like with abortion, let's say, right? There's a sense of harm to fetuses.
Yeah.
If you believe that life starts at conception, it comes from kind of religious convictions in large part. And so that's a very obvious kind of way that harm kind of like drives our moral judgments and assumptions about who or what is harmed, right, is created. But I've tried to do this more systematically and kind of focused on four clusters. I'm not going to call them foundations because I don't think they're carved into the brain. But the clusters are, the environment, things like coral reefs, planet Earth, the othered, so folks that are outside the kind of center of American society, so trans folks, Muslims, undocumented immigrants. You could call them marginalized people, but
Yeah.
conservatives might argue who's marginalized. The powerful, like state troopers, CEOs, authority figures, and then the divine. So think like the Bible, God, Jesus. And so one really nice thing, one kind of common ground is that everyone kind of agrees on the order of these things, thinking that the environment and the othered are relatively more susceptible to victimization or mistreatment than CEOs and Bibles. Okay, great. So there's some common ground, but there's really huge differences in where liberals and conservatives kind of see the relative placing of these clusters. So liberals tend to see the othered and the environment as extremely vulnerable to harm, as almost like an oppressed group, right? Just incredibly vulnerable to harm, and kind of corporate leaders and cops and the divine as very invulnerable to harm. So you get this like really big gap between like oppressed and oppressor, right? Which is why liberals are more likely to support Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, right? Because Black folks seem much more oppressed than police officers, or the murder of Brian Thompson, the healthcare CEO, right? Many progressives were like, yeah, good riddance, right? He's an oppressor who causes harm. He's not part of a group that's vulnerable to harm, right? So there's these really big differences, oppressed and oppressor, in terms of how most liberals view the world, and we've got data that back this up. But conservatives, on the other hand, it's really much narrower in terms of the difference between the kind of vulnerable and the invulnerable. Instead, it's more about kind of individual conceptions of victimization. So it doesn't matter if you grew up rich or poor, if you're a CEO or you're a minimum wage worker, right? Everyone, if they get cut with a knife, bleeds, right? Everyone can feel pain. And so it's this kind of more individualistic sense of victimization. And so this explains why conservatives are against affirmative action, right? For school admissions, because if you're a white student or a black student and you work hard, right, the sadness of you not getting into college is equal, no matter your race, right, if you worked hard for it. And so I think for conservative folks, right, it's about kind of like who you are and the decisions you make. Taxes, right? You should keep the money you make because we're all equal. We all make our choices. Whereas kind of progressives are like, no, eat the rich, like literally, right, as a rallying cry. And you don't eat things that can suffer, right? And so I think that's where the big differences are. These kind of like meta narratives about we're all kind of equal in terms of victimization, individual victimization versus like the progressive kind of group-based concerns about mistreatment or victimization.
So two thoughts about that. 'Cause I find it a really neat analysis. One's a question, which is, I'm curious, so why would you be drawn one way versus another way? Do you think it's just the culture you're raised in, or do you think it's personalities are drawn to one way or another way? But the other thing, and answer both either, whatever. But the other thing is, you're very careful in the book to be very even-handed, and I don't view this as a problem. You're kind of walking the walk. You want to appeal. You want to make a case that's broad. So you don't really make a case from one versus the other. But as you're talking now, it seems, and this could just be true. It seems like what the conservatives get that's more right. The liberals are more guilty of what you call moral typecasting, the extremes. You're a victim or a victimizer. But that's wrong. The world's more complicated than that. And it's in some way, it sounds like you're saying now, and again, it's not a criticism, that in this regard, the conservatives have it more right. They acknowledge that it's more of a continuum and people could be both.
So I'll answer the first question first, which is where do these come from? And I think it's a complicated question. Where does culture come from, right? Where do world value, kind of worldviews come from? Your parents, your religion, your workplaces. I mean, just how we talk to our kids too, right, about the world. You can kind of emphasize like these people need extra help and they're very different than us, but we need to help those people, right? That could be one way. Or you could say, Brett, you know, we have just as much right as anybody else, and we're just as worthy, and we're all equal, right? And so you could kind of inculcate these views in your children based on schools, right, and so forth. In terms of, who has it right, I mean, I think it's complicated, and I think this is why you can have people who are on the left and have people who are on the right, and they can both be thinking reasonable people. Um, and that is that, yes, of course, victimhood is in some ways powerfully an individual thing, right? Pain we feel in our bodies, in our minds, right? I can't even feel your pain, right? If you like just like slapped yourself in the face, right? I would think that would hurt, but I'm not you, right? I'm trapped within my own mind. I can't experience your thoughts. And so there is a sense that like victimhood is individual, but there also is a sense kind of supporting the progressive cause that there's a statistical truth here about which people are more likely to be victimized than others, right? So it's just kind of mathematically the case if you look across the US that, African Americans are more likely to be harmed than white folks in many cases, right? Growing up poor is just much worse for you than growing up rich, right? It's just generally better to be a CEO than maybe, a minimum wage worker. Like if you had to pick behind a veil of ignorance, like who
Yeah.
would you be? You would certainly pick being a white CEO because it's just life is better statistically for those folks, even if they can suffer, right? Fundamentally as a human being. And so I think, you can see, truth on both sides. And then the question is, if you're progressive, you come down in the statistical truth. And if you're conservative, you come down in this kind of individual kind of essence of victimhood.
Good, good. Just to sort of dig in deeper, you answered the question of why some people are conservative, some people are liberal, have this mindset and that mindset in terms of how you're raised and cultural upbringing, and it totally makes sense. And it's in some way, it certainly has to be true that the family you're raised in, the culture will sway you on your views on this. You know, neither of us think slavery is a good idea, but that's almost certainly because we're brought up in a culture which says slavery is a bad idea. If we were brought up at a different time, we'd have different views. But are you at all tempted? I mean, I'm always tempted to view saying that there's a sort of some people are more prone to be liberal, some people are more prone to be conservative. Um, John Haidt, name will go over and over again, would say that maybe has to do with things like openness to experience or conscientiousness or neuroticism. Some people say it has to do with sensitivity to threat. Some people say it has to do with, well, even there's some work showing that big muscular guys like us are more likely to be conservative than sort of thin, scrawny guys, because it's just. So, do you think any of that plays a role, or you're skeptical?
I mean, I'm certainly in favor of trying to explain, right? I mean, it's turtles all the way down in a sense, right? And so, there's moral differences on top of liberal and conservatism, which is explained by something else. And so I'm really trying to focus on like, assuming that people are liberals and conservative, where do their moral judgments come from and how can we make sense of those judgments? I feel like in the book, I go back millions of years to human nature
Yep.
when we were ancient hominids, and so if I go too much more into kind of like the neuroscience of our ideology, the book would be like 4 times bigger than it is. But I'm sympathetic to the idea that there's maybe personality differences, or if you're strong and you're tough and you think might makes right, it's easier to believe that, right? If you're mighty than if you're meek, certainly. I think there's questions of class that come into it as well.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
I know that there's things like education, as educators, as professors, we often get targeted as kind of like subverting the youth towards progressive causes. But I do think, there's something about learning about different perspectives, about travel as well. I've heard some work showing that if you kind of travel and live in different cultures, you're more likely to be progressive because you just see that other people are like you. That's kind of like you
Yeah.
appreciate differences. So I think there many things that then again if you're in the army maybe you travel as well and you're more likely to be conservative there, so I think it's complicated. I think there's definitely many things that help explain it, and I don't know really with certainty what those things are.
So you say, and this is the view you have, that it's complicated how you get to have a sort of conservative moral view and a liberal moral view. It's complicated precisely in what these views come down to in terms of the categories you apply them to. But what's not complicated for you, big theme in the book, is ultimately it's all about harm. And this is a claim about morality in general that you make. And, it's I find I'm not entirely persuaded, though I'm not also persuaded by John Haidt's foundation view. And as you know, there's other views out there. Morality is about cooperation, morality is about self-control,
Mhm.
morality, different things. I'll give you
I
this sort
think
of
I think
case.
I'll just say
Go
I
ahead.
think all
Yeah.
those views are consistent with morality as preventing harm. So morality is about self-control. Is I think you're probably the editor of this BBS paper, right? They argue that the reason we care about puritanical morality, like not drinking too much and not being sexually profligate, is because those things protect us and our societies from harm. And so I think the key point is that we have to broaden our understanding of what harm is, right? If you're
Yeah.
fixated on the kind of Jonathan Haidt, like harm is just care, it's just kind of
Yeah.
physical violence or emotional kind of like warfare, then I think that's too narrow. Instead, you need to think about harm as human beings do, as cultural beings, right? If we don't sing, the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning, say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning, does that weaken our country and allow terrorists to better attack us, right? Like these are the kind of broader, more symbolic harms that we're really fighting about in the culture war because there's not as obvious a there, right? We all
Yeah.
think that child abuse is immoral because that's obvious, but these other things are more constructed harms.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right to point out a sort of lack of empathy on the part of moral psychologists. So moral psychologists, this is, I'm not sure it's the example you give, but moral psychologists say, oh, there are people who are against gay marriage. Gay marriage doesn't hurt anybody. So what's up with those people? They must have this weird purity, sexual weird thing. But the question isn't whether gay marriage actually hurts people, it's whether gay marriage people think gay marriage hurts people. And you would argue that someone who's against gay marriage believes it might harm children, it might harm society, it might do things. And whether or not they're right or wrong is besides the point from a psychologist's point of view. You would say it's driven by harm intuitions. And we're often because we have our own political views, we fail to make the sort of empathic jump and see things through their eyes. So I get that. I guess I would think look, I wrote a book called Against Empathy, so I'm used to strong claims. Uh, but I wonder whether you could live with the idea that it might be 95% harm. So like here's a case I sort of buy, which is my mom died a while ago. I would feel, suppose I made a promise to her before she died. I would feel really bad about breaking a promise. And so why? Well, I don't actually, if I believed in an afterlife and she's in heaven and she cries, then that makes total sense. But I don't believe in an afterlife. I think she's just gone. But there's some things which maybe because as a rule they're bad, breaking a promise. And in a specific case, it's not bad, but it percolates through it. Do you are dietary restrictions? Some people think, oh, I can't violate my religion's dietary restrictions because it will hurt God's feelings. But other people say, I was just raised this way. It would feel wrong. Is there a
Yeah.
space for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that, you wrote another book called Descartes' Baby about a kind of being intuitive dualists, right? That even if
Yeah,
you know that, as a scientist, that we are just bodies and nothing else, right? We can't help but feel like we have a soul. It's intuitive. And so I think if you step back and you think, what is morality? Well, morality is an intuitive feeling of right or wrong. And I think the field, in large part thanks to John, underwent this change a couple decades ago that now we understand morality is more about our gut feelings than it is about kind of our conscious reasoning, right? So we all agree, not everyone, most of us agree that morality is about this gut feeling, this kind of intuition. And I think the key point I'm making is that perceptions of harm too are about visceral intuitions, right? There's something at your gut level. And this just makes sense, right? If you are standing on a balcony, one of those like big high-rise towers, and there's a glass kind of railing, and you're leaning over and looking over the edge, you get this fluttering in the pit of your stomach. It just feels unsafe, even if you know it's safe, right? Millions of years of evolution is telling you you should feel bad about this, right? Because this could probably kill you. And so I think the same kind of gut feelings that probabilistically led to harm in our past happen for, I don't know, the idea that cousins could get married, the idea of eating shellfish in the desert, right? So all these things can still be condemned based on how harmful they feel, but it's based on how they feel. So another example
yeah,
is, you're afraid of flying, let's say, right? We're like up in the air, you're looking at the window, you're sweating. And I said, Paul, why are you so upset? Why are you afraid? And you're just like, I'm just like terrified of flying. We're
yeah,
gonna we're gonna die. And I said, but Paul, it's safer to fly than to drive. And so if you know consciously that flying is so safe, there must be some other reason why you're afraid of flying, right? We must be close to heaven on the plane. And so it must be something about purity or God that makes you afraid of flying. You must have a purity module or a foundation that makes you afraid of flying. And obviously that's not the case, right? You just don't believe that it's harmless. And so
yeah,
in the case of
yeah,
your breaking your mother's promise, right? I mean, these things are gut feelings. And I want to also point out that there's a continuum of immorality, right? From like taking a walk on the beach to genocide to lots of things
yeah,
in between. So when people say that like, well, this feels kind of harmful, like, eating a cheeseburger if you were raised kosher, even though you're not observant
yeah,
anymore. Like maybe that feels harmful, but not as bad as, stabbing your neighbor in the neck. So I think if you think there's a continuum of immorality and there's a continuum of harm, that's what I'm arguing, right? This intuitive continuum, this feeling of harm, and that gives rise to this intuitive continuum of moral condemnation.
So, so you would say that in the mother case, your belief is at some gut level, I think she's around to be hurt by my breaking her thing, even though I might explicitly deny it, but at some gut level, I feel that.
That's right, right. And so I think we could, we've run studies where we examine people's psychophysiology when they're contemplating these, harmless things, and people get really activated, right? It's
You
totally
you you
harmless.
you did this study once. I remember bashing things or
Yeah.
kidding.
Yeah. So but that's enough to get me going, right? So we wanted to say, well, or look at like what would happen if you get people to do harmless things they know are explicitly harmless, right? And if there's morality that's not grounded in harm, then it should be totally possible for people to do harmless things because you're like, look, I know that's harmless. I can still do it, right? It's not a big deal. And so this was at Harvard when I was a grad student. I loved the IRB at Harvard when I was there. I also ran a study where we gave people a ton of electric shocks. Never changed IRB there. Um,
This is a human ethics review board,
yeah, that's right. That's
or
right.
lack of
Or
thereof.
lack of.
Yeah.
Um, but we had people, there's an experimenter and, he'd be the one running the study. And part of the study would be, okay, the experiment tells you, pick up this handgun, cock it. It's a fake gun, but it feels very heavy. Cock it and now shoot me in the face. Totally harmless. It's just theater, right? But people really hesitate when they try to do this. And you show that physiologically they just get massive, right? Physiological arousal. They get massive reactions, kind of gut feelings. We also had it where, someone would slam a hammer into your leg, but it was actually a piece of PVC piping, or hit a baby, a fake baby, a doll, I guess you'd call it, against a desk. So all these things are harmless, right? But in your gut, you still kind of feel that they're harmful. And again, if you think about evolution for good reason, you know, morality and evolution, right, programmed us to be generally concerned about the things that are harmful to ourselves and generally things that are evil. And so if someone's like, hey, you can sleep with your sister just this one time and it's totally cool, just take my word for it, it probably makes sense not to take their word for it? And so I think in general, it makes sense to be like not conservative in the way of politics, but just conservative
Yeah.
in the way we make our moral judgments, and just think that there might be harm there because if there is, it's better to avoid it than to embrace it.
Yeah, and in fact, in your book, you cite some studies, I think the point, which is a lot of psychologists give these scenarios that are carefully designed to have no harm in them, according to psychologists. And then they tell people, look, there's no harm. And people find that they're wrong. And then the conclusion is Kirk Gray's mistaken. You could have wrongness without harm. But you point out correctly that when you go back and ask the people, was there harm? They would say, yeah, I didn't accept the premise. The
Right.
psychologist told me there's no harm, but it's ridiculous. It's like an experiment where you ask me, is it wrong to punch somebody in the face? I say, of course. And you say, is it wrong to punch somebody in the face if it doesn't hurt them at all? And I say, it's still wrong. But because I don't believe you, I don't believe. How
Right.
could you punch somebody in the face? It doesn't hurt them at all. And the sort of incest cases, and these are cases, there's some very garish cases, strike us. There's all sorts of reasons why we're likely to believe that they're wrong. Um,
I should
and
just say that moral psychologists are, the weirdest bunch of people ever, right? Like it's just funny that we're like, this is how everyday people think. And we're trying to make inferences about everyday people, including, a large swath of the country that's like conservative and evangelical. And it kind of we're sitting here thinking of like, let's think about incest. Let's think about eating pizza off a corpse, which is one of my favorite items from a moral survey. And
we're, we're
so
we're losing viewers right now. Eating pizza, they're just kind of stitching
I
off,
know. So
or people are calling their friends to listen.
or some of these things are just so far away, I think, from the kind of divisions that people face in their lives, right? The disagreements, the kind of everyday disagreements we have over, right? Is your kid the victim on the playground or is my kid, right? And so I think, so even if it's 95%, and I think it's more than that, I think I'd be happy just saying that like most of morality is about kind of
Okay.
arguments about harm and victimization. And this, I think, better explains kind of where we're at in today's political moment.
So about today's political moment and about liberals versus conservatives, you talk about this really interesting notion in your book of concept creep. And I think this is from the standpoint of talking about harm and then talking about what's our intuition, what's right and wrong, is super interesting. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. So I guess there's a little bit of a backstory, right? Which is for so long, humans have been um, in danger physically. And if we go back into the mists of time, right, in the book, I argue that we're more prey than predator. And our ancestors spend most of the times like huddling in trees and hoping not to get eaten by big cats. And then, of course, as we evolved and formed societies, right? We became safer and safer. We formed institutions. We formed all sorts of things that keep us safe. Um, but it was a long time that we were really endangered. And our brains are hardwired to search for threats and search for harms, right? If you, thinking back in time, right, were wandering through a forest and you weren't vigilant to like bears or pumas, you were going to get eaten. And so our ancestors who survived, those people who eventually had, kids like you and me, uh, were the kind of people who were preoccupied with threats. And so our minds today are still preoccupied with threats. And even though we don't face threats from like wild animals, right, there's still some kind of harms that we worry about. But as you move through time, increasingly we become safer and safer. So I talked to my mom not so long ago about what it was like to grow up in northern Ontario. And she told me stories of kids who died. They suffocated in fridges, they drowned in the lake. They didn't used to be child car locks. One kid was a 3-year-old having a tantrum, opened the car door and fell out onto the highway at full speed. He died, right? Christmas trees had candles on them. They lit on fire, and 2 kids died on her street when this happened. Like terrible things happened all the time, right? Obvious harms. Today, less terrible obvious harms, even though I'm going to say, right, any obvious harms, any violence, any suffering is bad, but less obvious harms. And yet we're still hardwired to detect threats. So what does this mean? Well, if you're motivated to find something and that thing becomes less prevalent, then our idea, our concept of what counts as that, it creeps. So I'll give you one more example, which is food. We are hardwired to want food. It's called being hungry. And in today's society where we have grocery stores and Uber Eats, whatever, what counts as food is relatively constrained, right? It has to be fresh made, it has to be sanitary. But now let's imagine it's post-apocalyptic, right? There's no more Uber Eats, there's no more grocery stores, and you find a tin of cat food. Well, now your concept of food has crept. Cat food now doesn't count as food, but if it was scarce, now cat food counts as food. And so with harms, it's the same way, right? If harms are relatively scarce today, at least compared to the past, then our concept of what counts as harmful creeps. So this could include, as you brought up already, things like microaggressions. Not to rip on John, but this idea of over coddling our youth. I like to think of going back to the Industrial Revolution in England and telling people whose kids are working 14 hours a day in a factory, you know what the biggest threat to kids are? Overprotecting him. Whereas these parents are worried about their kids losing their hands in kind of the spinning jenny or whatever, right? I mean, only today in society where we're relatively safe can we worry about things, these relatively minor harms. Even 20 years ago, I lived in England as a 13-year-old, and we played a game called Headers, Volleys, and Beats, which basically involved, playing soccer, and then when someone gets goals scored on them, everyone who's playing punches them as hard as they could in the arm.
Yeah.
And that was seen as like good old school time fun in England. And I think today you wouldn't play that, and I wouldn't want my kids to play that. But it's still this kind of like this changing landscape of what we see as harmful.
So you're giving off this Grandpa Simpson vibe, and I've been there, which is a little bit, well, kids today, back in the day, I'd lose a soccer game and I'd be buried alive and set on fire, and that's what they did. And now the kids cry when their avocado toast is lukewarm, and microaggressions and so on. And in your book, you point out that look, the expansion of the domain of harm under your theory means an expansion domain of evil. More harms, the more immorality, and that got to be a bad thing. So again, it's sort of similar to what I was saying before, which is a lot of your book is sort of implicitly a criticism about sort of conservatives. If you look closely, this seems like saying this is a way in which progressives and liberals have done things wrong. They've let harm creep too much. Now they see evil everywhere.
Well, I think, I think I try to be pretty even-handed, and I think both liberals and conservatives see the creep of harm. I think in terms of, coddling America's youth, I think conservatives care about that as well. I mean, I was at a grant panel some years ago, and there were conservative folks there and liberal folks there, and the conservative folks were talking about microaggressions and how it's terrible and, the safe
Yep.
spaces that liberals need. And then this conservative psychologist was talking about how, it's actually really hard for him to be one of the few conservatives in his department because when people walk by him in the hallway, they give him dirty looks
Yeah.
and they don't invite him to parties. And so he just feels like he doesn't have a place to really express his views. And so I turned to him and I said, "Well, it seems like you need a safe space away from these microaggressions you're facing."
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, at the end of the day, I think that there's so many more similarities between liberals and conservatives and how we conceive of the world. And of course, we understand different harms and what's going to kind of drive those harms on the left and the right. But I do think that the creep of harm is something we're all guilty of. But I also think it's a good thing, right? Like the reason that we care about the well-being of our animals so much, right, is because we have so much disposable income and because
Yeah.
our, children and people are relatively safe, right? Back in the day, you didn't care about animal rights because you had to be so concerned about the suffering of your family. But now you can think about like, oh, does my dog need another sweater when it goes out into the Arctic vortex, right? The reason that we're so fixated on the kind of like well-being of our pets, again, is because we're relatively safe. So I think the creep of harm is actually a good thing because it suggests that we're much safer than we ever have been. There's a normative claim out there about how we should make our discussions and how we should make our decisions. I'm a moral psychologist, as you are, right? So I'm trying to make descriptive claims about how our minds work. And so in this study, we asked people, what should a political opponent talk about for you to respect them in a conversation? The majority of people, I think it's like 56% of people, they say, give me the facts. I want the facts, just the facts, no editorializing. We say, great. Okay, you're going to have a conversation now. Here are some facts from folks on the other side. And now people say, those are not facts. Those are not the right facts, right? I want the right facts that support my view. And so today we have fake facts. We have kind of totally separate news medias,
Yeah.
social medias. And facts just, I don't know if they've ever been kind of all we think they are, but especially today, right? They are not the way that we can find common ground. Instead, right, my studies show that when we discuss personal stories, particularly those about harm, so if I tell you, look, this is the reason why I'm pro-gun rights, because here's how many times people use handguns in America every year to protect themselves, you'd be like, whatever, you can get a stat from anywhere. But if I
Yeah.
say, look, the reason I'm pro-gun rights is because my mom used a gun to defend herself from a home invader when I was a kid,
Yeah.
then you say, oh, well, that seems true in a really deep way that is not true in terms of a stat. Even though, as psychologists, right, we teach people anecdotes are not truth in the same way that data are. But to everyday people, and even to, even psychologists talking about morality or disagreeing about it, those stories have a really powerful weight and make you see the other person as rational. Because even if you disagree about their kind of starting assumptions, you can see that they're concerned about protecting themselves and their family from harm. So I don't think, we shouldn't throw facts out the window. Facts do matter. But maybe if you're having a conversation with someone you disagree with, don't just get in there with like, I heard this fact on NPR and you're so wrong. Like that. That's not the best way to have conversations about morality and politics. Start with the personal, start with the human connection, and then kind of softly go into the facts on the matter.
So that's interesting. The final part, because in some way, I think your answer is a good answer, but it's to a subtly different question than I might wonder. You're answering the question, how do I get along with somebody from a different point of view? How could I have a civil, good conversation with them? I'm with the racist uncle and the Antifa cousin over Thanksgiving. And how do I going to deal with all of that? And the idea is focus on harm, don't throw a bunch of facts at them. And I get that. But suppose I wanted to ask, how can I persuade people? Would it, or to be symmetrical, how could I be open myself up to persuasion? I'm not sure all this empathy and sharing of harm would do that. Or do you think it would?
I think it would more than whatever we're doing right now. And I appreciated the symmetry of your question, right? And I think it's telling that almost no one asks that question, right? Out of the many times I had conversations about this book, no one's ever thought, how can I be more open to other views,
Yeah.
right? It's always, how can I persuade the other side that they're wrong? And everyone who's listening right now can think back in their lives, like how many times has anyone ever proved you wrong about an important moral conviction that you had, right? Someone throws some stat about abortion, you're like, oh my goodness, you know what? Thank you. That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, people more start to moralize things like vegetarianism, right? But it's usually you hear stories of animal suffering, right? You're compelled, you're moved by the kind of like showcasing suffering or harm. And so I think that is the way to persuasion or opening yourself up, right? Telling these stories, thinking in terms of people's experiences, and and that's really the kind of human way that we're used as storytelling animals to connect with others, right? It's not kind of throwing facts that we heard impartially on some news media. And so I think that persuasion is maybe possible, but only when we first understand someone. And we rush into these conversations trying to win immediately, when what we should be trying to do is, if we understand where people are coming from, it opens them up to our ideas and to learning about what we think too. And so, understanding and not just winning.
So America's in a funny place. I've always been skeptical. I've been very persuaded by people like Steven Pinker, who argue the world's been getting better and better. And because of that, I roll my eyes when people say this is a uniquely bad time. But there's one exception to this, which is the political divide in America. And I don't know, you probably mentioned these facts in the book, but it used to be Republicans had Democratic friends and people would kind of get along. And now there's polarization like you've never seen before, sort of Trumpian motion that each side hates the other one and thinks the other one's scum of the earth. So is the idea that a lot of people read your book and at least maybe the people in the extremes are lost, but your sort of majority people will then have these dialogues and because of that, compromises or moral change will happen?
I mean, that's the hope, that there's grassroots change. But even if I can't change the political moment in America, if I can't, fight the power of big tech algorithms that incite outrage in their, platforms, or change how Congress is structured, if I can give people the tools to understand why we're divided and to have better conversations and better connection with those who disagree with them in their lives, the coworker who they have a disagreement with, as you say, the uncle, who you disagree with, or the cousin, right? The Trump uncle, or the cousin from Oberlin who's like, wow,
Yeah.
even progressives, right? There's people who are too progressive out there, or even like conservatives, or people who are too conservative. And I think it's a way of trying to, find less division in our lives, as we just want to, live and connect and be a person in the world. And so my hope is that the book will help people do that, but not just about politics, right? I mean, one example, I talk about kind of having a disagreement with my wife, right? Or you like have disagreement with other parents about your kids. Those are all moral disagreements too. And I think understanding like how our minds work and why we get outraged, and kind of stepping back from our caricature of the other side, whether it's on politics or just someone who votes different than you on the HOA, right, who's an otherwise 100% aligned with you politically, I think is a really important thing to do. And I think people are hungry for a little less division and a little less anger in the world.
I should end with that, but we have a minute, and I'm gonna ask one last question.
Right.
Because you walk into it in your book, you mentioned in passing what you call a deficit theory of research, which is that people are drawn to study what they lack. So, 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 is it that it's so? What makes you situated to write this book? Do you feel you definitely don't lack morality? Do you feel you lack outrage? Do you feel like explain yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do feel a little bit like I lack outrage. I mean, I know there's been studies on this, that as people become kind of more trying to make sense of folks on both sides. I mean, even I certainly have strong political convictions. They're probably not surprising if you know that I grew up in Canada. Um, but I think, I do have a hard time getting as really upset for as long a time as people do in society. And I think that's because I also study how people perceive the minds of others. And I try to understand how people are thinking and how people are feeling. And that's where my research really started before I got into morality. And so that's kind of my core conviction of just like trying to understand what's going on in the mind of others. It's super important today when it comes to morality and politics, and trying to give people a sense that they might too feel less outraged if they understood a little better as well.
Great. And what I took from that is your answer is because you're Canadian. And
That's
and
right.
and
That's a
since I'm
dodge
Cana
you can
and
always use.
since I'm Canadian too, yeah, we just
But
we
two
just we just
Canadians,
we
right?
just it's two Canadians just saying, why are people so upset? Just listen. Okay. Thank you, Kurt. That was fantastic.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for a great deep dive into Kurt's work. I appreciate for all the nerds on the screen. They're all really enjoying and eating it up. And Kurt, I know that you're a little under the weather, so I appreciate you powering through and taking part in after hours as well.